Know me. It's a pleasure being here. Dan, thank you for the introduction. Well, I've been tasked with the awesome task of actually addressing what's new for 2020, where we see things going. And so I'm going to jump around a little bit. I try to cover as many topics that I think are relevant and personally that make me excited. Was everybody thinking about regulatory in 2020? Any thoughts come out? What are the first things that come out with regulatory changes for medical device diagnostics in 2020? There you go. We'll start with that. But we won't talk too much about the EU MDR because everybody's tired and sick of hearing about it. And then we'll go into some positive things. So I'm with Brownwood CKC. We're an international regulatory consulting firm. I'm based here in the South Bay area. And the firm has a lot of offices in Asia Pacific. We do end-to-end regulatory and quality consulting, whether it be a regulatory strategy to meetings with FDA to post-market recalls and the such. I've been around for 20 years, and we cover a significant amount of different services, including distributor commercialization support, reimbursement, basically you name it, we can do it for medical device diagnostic or pharmaceutical companies. So I'll start with a global landscape and overview of the regulatory changes. Let's take it into perspective. This is a little bit outdated, but it gives you the sense. The global medtech landscape is divided into roughly, 4 big markets. This is the standard market. It doesn't really reflect the growth in markets. As we see, the biggest growth areas are actually in Asia. You can imagine. But US, North America, really does represent a significant amount of this market. So it's just kind of laying the land there. So if we go to major regulatory changes, MDR and IVDR is top of mind. Basically, it's turning around the regulations on its head in Europe. It's actually catching up to other places, really to make it not as drastic. The biggest problem is the crunching time and the lack of availability of reviewers. So if you were to think, okay, what would be similar to that in here in the US terms? It's as if the FDA said, we're gonna have to review every single medical device and we're gonna fire 75% of our reviewers. And you have a deadline until May to get it done. That's basically what's happening in Europe. Canada is now accepting or actually requiring MDSAP. Anybody familiar with MDSAP? Medical Device Single Audit Program. We'll talk a little bit about that. It's a very interesting development. Australia is now adapting to the regulatory changes and they're actually accepting other approvals other than the CE mark. For over all the history, CE mark was the standard way to go. But now we're looking at what's happening in Europe and they're adapting. And I think that this is something that probably will be happening in other countries in Asia Pacific as well. Then you have China. China has a mandate to update about 1,000 guidances within months. And they keep changing and it's increasingly changing. The things they've promised are that they're going to start accepting type testing and that they're going to start accepting international clinical data. That's a very high bar to meet. But they are thinking that they need to be more open to new technologies. We have India actually implementing the medical device regulations. So as before, there were a very narrow list of medical devices that were regulated in India. Now they're regulating all medical devices. So something to be aware of. They're rolling out their medical device regulations. And then we have Brexit in the middle of the whole thing. Why is Brexit so important to medical device industry? Well, interestingly, UK's notified bodies, so if you would, the FDA equivalents in Europe, the UK ones that are based in UK would approve about 80% of the high-risk medical devices in Europe. That's how important it was. But it's actually settling down and we're figuring out what's gonna happen and it's not gonna be as dire. To put things into perspective again, 2011, there was a study and it was analyzing where did medical innovators go first. And the vast majority, 65% of 80% of the innovative companies will go to Europe first because it was easier. We believe that's being turned on its head. And we believe that FDA is kind of at the forefront. If we look at the FDA strategic plan from 2018 to 2020, a very interesting read. One of their models is simplicity. So this actually is only about 20 pages and it's actually digestible for non-regulatory people. I'm sorry that this is a little blurry, but they're targeting that by the end of 2020, innovative companies, 50% of them are actually going to be targeting the US. This is a significant change. If you look at the previous slide, the US was 4%. Now it's got from 4% in 2011, they are aiming to get 50% of innovative companies looking at FDA first. This is one of the reasons I'm going to focus a little bit on FDA and what they're trying to do to make this happen. So I'll talk a little bit of MDR. People are going to be like, okay, we know it. But very succinctly summarizing it, I talked about the issue with notified bodies. That's the side on governance. On governance, there's going to be very few notified bodies. We're talking about before the MDR, there was 160. We might have 20 total. And every medical device needs to be reviewed. So there's no legacying in. So, and there's also a lot more liability on notified bodies. So that's going to make things a little bit tough. The deadline for MDR is May of this year. So there's a lot of talks about, there's a possibility of a healthcare crisis. There's a possibility of probably discretionary enforcement from the European bodies. We don't know. It's a little bit uncertain. And then the requirements are getting stringent. Yes, there's a lot of products that have been in the market for 30 years, have never had an adverse event. Now they don't have enough clinical data to actually continue supplying. And we have clients who are thinking, let's pull out of Europe and go to other markets. So that's kind of what's happening in Europe in a very quick and oversimplified manner. So FDA is evolving. FDA is positioning themselves a little bit differently. I'm going to do like a very high-level walkthrough of the FDA in terms of medical devices. This applies in a high level as well to diagnostics. So for Class 1 devices, it's basically a self-registration. If you are an innovator and you have figured out that you can have a product that's low risk with getting very few features as a Class 1, we can help you get your basic essential quality system in place, make sure your labeling is controlled, your manufacturing is controlled, and you send a note, and in a week you get approval for a Class 1 product. So you are ready to go to the market that way. Some people don't realize that. And it's like, wow, we could be in the market testing with a very basic version of our medical device, and then upscale to Class 2. Class 2 is what the bulk is. 83% of the efforts of FDA over the last year was in review of 510Ks, which are the Class 2 products. Interestingly, if you're a traditional 510K, only about 15%, 15% of 510Ks of Class 2 products actually require a clinical trial. They actually, the majority are approved based on equivalence testing in the laboratory. And you have the Class 3, the high-risk products. Those are the pre-market approvals. Those do require clinical trials. We don't see a lot of changes happening in the Class 3, but there's a lot of things happening in the Class 2 devices, which I mentioned was the vast majority.
Can you give some examples of Class 2 and 3?
So a Class 3 is a implantable defibrillator, something that's going to keep your heart pumping. A Class 2 is software as medical device by default are Class 2. So all this talk about digital health, the vast majority are Class 2s. If you look at a continuous glucose monitor, that's a Class 2 type of thing. So submission types for Class 2 devices. Do you have the traditional? The vast majority are traditional. As I mentioned, only 15% of traditional require clinical trials. There's abbreviated. I mentioned because it's so well known that you just meet a standard and you're good to go. There's a special where you're increasing. This is a very good innovative strategy for the innovators where you get a very simple 510K in. It doesn't really meet anything for you. But then you got that approval. Now you get that as predicate to your next level. And you start incrementally building. The top medical device companies do it, so it's a strategy to keep in mind. And then you have the de novo. De novo 510Ks are becoming more popular because FDA is now making this not be a black box. They actually want people to come in because technology is changing and evolving, that basically a de novo 510K is a very good way to approach the regulation. One thing that people sometimes don't realize is the opportunities to meet with FDA. We don't encourage companies to go and just meet with them without having a good regulatory person in the table, because whereas it's free and you will have meeting minutes taken out, it's non-binding. You can screw it up by going and asking open-ended questions like, do you think we need a clinical trial? You never ask the FDA if you need a clinical trial because they're going to be conservative. We come and say, given this rationale, given the predicates, this is why we don't need a clinical trial, and this is the preclinical testing we suggest. Do you agree? They say yes or no. That's the kind of approach. But there are multiple opportunities to meet with FDA. One of the reasons they're getting 50% of companies to consider FDA is because they're becoming a lot more open. Whereas before it was like, you go to FDA, you might get like, handcuffed, and you're all paranoid. It's no longer the case. Actually, FDA is very communicative. If you do it right, just don't go in there and try to just get educated by making a call with FDA. If you're making a meeting with FDA, if you haven't read the appropriate guidance documents, it's not going to be a good stepping stone. 2018 update report. So the first bullet is very interesting. Whereas FDA is interested in getting new technologies, they're not just making it easier for everybody. They've actually increased 46% of audits over the years. So they're auditing a lot more, and they're getting smarter. They're actually using signals to actually decide who's going to get an audit. So they're applying even artificial intelligence, AI metrics, to identify where there might be issues in manufacturers, and they're showing up in those doors, as opposed to just gunshot approach was historically the case. Very interestingly, if you go to the next 2 points, is from a report of they're modernizing the 510K process. So the 510K submissions, the Class 2 submissions, have increased in volume 150%. So they're actually being very rigid in requiring a lot of information, but they're not necessarily making it harder. We don't believe that's the case. They just want a good submission. The last point is an administrative check that innovators should be aware of. They're actually having a pre-checklist screening of 510K submissions. So those that go like Lone Rangers and want to write their own, about 30% of submissions are now being rejected because they didn't just meet the minimum standards. And I'm talking about like an office administrator looking through your submission to say what you're missing. So some interesting things about updates. Now let's talk about harmonization and cooperation at a macro scale. These flags represent the participating countries for NDSAP, and something I'm very, very excited about. These flags represent a big part of the market, right? We're talking about US, we're talking about Brazil, we're talking about Canada, Japan, Australia, not menial countries. So MDSAP stands for Medical Device Single Audit Program. There's two things that a regulator is gonna try to ensure that you're meeting. There's a quality system part and there's a development design part. From a quality system part, for these 5 regulators, you can be set by just deciding to do this voluntary program. It's voluntary for the 4 countries except for Canada. If you want to market anything in Canada, you have to get an NDSAP process. NDSAP process is equivalent to a 13485. It has a little bit of a technical file-ish component. We estimate about a 20% more effort to get 13485. Companies throw their hands up and say, oh, MDSAP is so expensive and such an effort. But if you do it intelligently and you do the MDSAP on an ISO 13485 surveillance audit, you're basically, in our estimation, going to be spending a little bit, 20% more than what you would just with the 13485 audit. So in other words, you can do those two at the same time. And the benefits that provides is that it streamlines your approval process to some of the countries, and the governing parties will leave you alone for annual audits. They won't go for surveillance audits as long as you have MDSAP. Yes, sir.
The statement you made 20% more, is that also true for electronic?
We believe it's a pretty good ballpark from a quality system standpoint. And the majority of the expenses I'm estimating are the notified body, the auditing expense. Now, from a preparation standpoint, there might be a little bit more internal resources that you need to spend, but it makes sense. Look at the adoption. This is the adoption of NDSAP. NDSAP has been rolled out as a pilot program about 2 years ago, and exponentially, companies are opting to participate in it. So, yeah, it's a little nuanced question. NDSAP, you have an authorized auditor that does the audit. That's a notified body, essentially. So if you get that certificate, all of these will accept it. Now, when we're talking about product registration, that's where there are exceptions. Well, when you're gonna be using MDSAP to get approval to enter a market, that's where you gotta look a little more in detail. But overall, you check the box for a quality system audit on a yearly basis by participating in this program. And it's really revolutionary. I mean, we're talking about one audit gets you covered to all these big jurisdictions. That means you don't have to worry about the knocking on your door. You have to have all this quality team ready to get audits and have translators and all that. So it makes sense from our standpoint, and we applaud that initiative. Now, where it gets really excited, this is quality systems, right? There's talk about a medical device single review program, and FDA is the one heading this. So I talked about QMS being one part, that's kind of the boring one, but this is talking about the technical file, the design review. There's a possibility of getting one approval, and that will get you approval in the other countries. Now, of course, the countries are gonna say it's subject to our discretionary policy, but this talks have been for a couple of years. MDRF is considering it, and just believe, man, this is the future. Why repeat the approval process in each country if they could actually get one, It's pie in the sky, but it is something tangible. The heads of FDA are talking about it here and there. So, I'm hoping something will happen about that in 2020. Let's move, yes. It's undetermined. MDSAP, for example, was voluntary. These countries were at the forefront at determining the requirements for NDSAP, right? That's the quality system. The Medical Device Single Review Program is being developed under the MDRF. And there's 30 countries participating in there. Our estimation is that the same top countries might be at the forefront of this as well. But it's speculation at the moment. We don't know. Possibly. Yeah, for approval. Be a dream. We might be out of a job. So going to digital health. And going from everybody's talking about digital health. It's phenomenal. Governing bodies are issuing guidance documents left and right. For people who are sort of in layman terms, software as medical device is where software is taking any data and giving a clinical output, like analyzing it or telling somebody to change. There's low risk areas where you don't need a software as medical device. There's the middle, where you gauge where your software is a medical device. And the end of it, the spectrum, is what people would usually think. That's the software that's part of a medical device. You don't need approval for the software that is part of a medical device. You need approval for the software that stands alone as an individual feature, and there's classifications of it. So the same things that I mentioned, type 1, 2, and 3, from FDA, these apply to software as medical device. Now, FDA is getting smart about this. Software as medical device involves a lot of AI. So from an AI standpoint that is supposed to update in algorithms on a daily basis, how are they gonna have a technical review of this product when it's essentially changing every week with more data? So they have this pre-certification pilot program. Top companies such as Apple, digital health companies are participating in this pilot, and we believe it could be pretty ground-changing for software companies. Basically, they will evaluate you in a voluntary basis for being a center of excellence, meaning that you're abiding on a voluntary basis to govern your software development. If you get the stamp of approval from a pre-cert program, the idea is that you don't have to get approval for more products. You can start rolling your algorithms, rolling your other products, because you are already shown to have been abiding to quality requirements from the FDA. So it's a phenomenal endeavor. This is published from the FDA, the possible benefits. Healthcare, patients getting products faster. Venture capitalists realizing returns faster. Products getting approved faster. Software companies being able to adapt faster. This is coming from the FDA, and we applaud that. We think that this is something that's going to be continuing to impact and provide opportunities for software as medical device companies. The Fda Innovative Designations. Anybody familiar with this? So FDA, basically, it's kind of like a patent review. I would make it analogous to that. I was recently in a webinar with OCRA, plug for OCRA, you should stop by. It's Orange County Regulatory Affairs Group. Pete is here from OCRA. We have a table there. We had 3 people from FDA calling in, and I asked the people from FDA, what is the main value you see from the FDA Innovative Designations? The number one answer they said is, it signals investors, and it doesn't cost you anything. So this is pretty interesting. It's been on the works for a long time. This is from a publication from 2011. They had to redraft this, but the idea is that if you are meeting an unmet need, FDA is going to put you in a different bucket. You're going to be in the top priority of the review process, and you're going to be able to have interactive conversations with FDA. The idea is that it was going to make things a lot quicker for you. But in reality, from the 2011 to date, there hasn't been really that realization of a shortage of it. But certainly, it's a signal to investors. What are the requirements? Basically, the first entry there is that you have to be meeting an unmet need. You have to show that this product is going to be in the interest of patients. And basically, that criteria gets put into a 10-page application. We submit it to FDA under the right guise of argument. And FDA will tell you within a couple of weeks if you got this designation. And that's a pretty good thing to go raise funds with. So how's it looking? EAP was the previous program from 2011. Those are the applicants. Breakthrough device designations, the one I'm talking about. In total, we see about 55% of companies who are applying for this are getting that designation. And I think that's really neat. So I had to make this very brief. Conclusions for trends in regulatory from a global standpoint. What once was no longer. Really evaluate your assumptions. You know, everybody used to go to Europe. Let's evaluate if that's the case for your product. You used to think that you have to have a big technical file for a software product. Let's evaluate if that's the case. I would argue you have to maintain a global perspective because there might be opportunities boiling up from different classifications, medical needs that you might not be aware of. The biggest growth for medical needs actually are in Asia, in developing countries. So why not? There's a lot of optimism for US regulation. FDA is getting bullish. They want innovative products now. They don't want to be seen as the obstructors to innovation. And I already kind of summed it up. Evaluate and consider innovative strategies for your product. Thank you for your time. We'll be having a panel afterwards, but I appreciate that there's any questions and we can take them out. Thank you.